Hello and welcome everybody. My name's Joanna Haigh and I have the privilege of being the director of the NERC Doctoral Training Partnership at Imperial College in Science and Solutions for a Changing Planet. And John Methven here is the director of the Scenario programme at the Universities of Reading and Surrey. And we're quite excited about this programme, which is our first initiative in terms of an event to engage with our partners. And the people who've registered for this event are about 50% from universities and academia, and about 50% from industries, government, NGOs, and other partners. So we think it's a very good mix. Just those of you that are perhaps who are not from academia and are wondering quite what a DTP is, this is a new way that the Natural Environment Research Council is funding support and training for PhD students. So they decided that instead of allocating studentships to individual departments, they would ask universities or groups of universities to bid for block funding of PhDs, and they would allocate across the whole remit of NERC science. And we had the first cohort starting last October, and so we're halfway through the first year. And we think it's going quite well, but we will find out as we go on. So, of course, as well as the very important component of the studentships, which is in research training, which has traditionally been what the PhD has been for, with a close relationship between the student and their PhD supervisor and a strong research link. These programs have an additional component, which is providing professional and technical skills, specific training, and also much more information on how to translate your research out to the real world and see its impact, particularly on policy. So an important component, and it's in the name, Doctoral Training Partnership, is in the partnerships. And that's essentially the basis of today's event. We hope to encourage a two-way exchange between the academics and the partners. So whereas the academics find out how environmental knowledge and information and research could be used in the wider world, and the partners can find out what's going on in the universities, and in this way exchange of information should be of mutual benefit. As partners, you may like to have a little bit of an idea of what you might be able to do as to contribute or benefit from the partnership, and there's many different modes in which you can do this. Some of you are already involved as project co-supervisors of individual students. Of course, there's a lot of ways in which students would like to be involved with individual companies, perhaps on placements, in terms of learning how to translate their research. You can become involved in some of the training components. Indeed, some of you already are. Thank you very much. Either by giving the odd lecture or providing some workshops or anything like this. We're actually listening for ideas. And also important in the DTPs is the idea of cohorts. So as I've said, the NERC funds these DTPs en masse, and the universities decide how to allocate the studentships across departments. And in that way, you have a cohort of students with interests right the way across the university or universities involved. And they sort of grow up together, they learn about each other's subjects, they get trained together, and they benefit from this interdisciplinary part of the programme. So NERC funded 15 of these doctoral training partnerships, and today we have 2 here represented. And we think, we're quite proud that we're the first such event which involves more than one doctoral training partnership in one event, and we're very happy to maintain this relationship with from Imperial, Reading and Surrey. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about the Imperial one. John will then tell you a bit about the Reading-Surrey one, and John will also tell you about what we expect to happen today and how it will pan out. So at Imperial, we have the Science and Solutions for a Changing Planet, which involves 11 Imperial College departments across the span of science, engineering, medicine and business. We also have 6 core partners and over 27 research support, industrial, policy agencies and NGOs as engaged partners, and many thanks to those of you that are doing that and that are here. NERC provides us with 15 studentships per year, and this will continue for 5 years. And but in the current cohort, we have actually 30 students because we've got an extra 15 who are engaged through funding from the Grantham Institute and also by association with departments who want their students to be part of this whole activity. Another important part of this is case studentships. We've always had case studentships, but now the case students who have some extra funding and engagement from partners are much more coherently involved in this training activity. So in terms of the training that we provide, we have specific training designed to teach the students about something about translation, about uncertainty and risk, about sustainability, and we have separate components on data handling, modelling and computing. And the students have all been exposed to these particular short training courses at the start of their PhD studentships. We're also now running extra courses which are voluntary courses, but which are quite popular in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship. And we'd love engagement from our partners in those. The cohorts are also involved in what we call team building activities and team challenges. And these are groups of about 8 students who meet regularly on a particular theme that they've chosen to build a solution for some environmental problem that they've identified. And they've come up with some really interesting problems, and we're seeing how those develop as we go on. So finally, just to say a little bit about the Grantham Institute. So this was set up at Imperial in 2007 with a generous funding from the Grantham Foundation. It was set up to encourage and support and extend research in climate change across Imperial College, to translate that research into real-world impact, and to make sure that any relevant, policy-relevant information got out to the right ears. It's been going for 7 years. It's really thriving. It's got strong engagement from departments across the college, and initiated a number of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research projects. And indeed, it set up a sort of prototype DTP by funding its own studentships in a number of different areas, which the students were then part of a cohort, which enabled us to be in a good position to set up this DTP now. So I think that's enough from me and enough about Imperial, and I'll hand over to John to talk a bit more.
Thank you, Jo. Sorry, I'll just flick through. So Scenario is another NERC doctoral training partnership, which involves 4 host partners. So host partners are the people who can provide lead supervisors for the students. So there's the University of Surrey, the University of Reading, and also Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is a NERC centre, and British Geological Survey. So they're the host partners. And then we have 22 other partners from private and public sector, including the Met Office, who probably provide the most case studentships that we have in our cohort. So the scope of Scenario is very broad, so it basically involves physics, chemistry and biology, but with more emphasis on the physical science side and links into engineering, and also environmental strategy and policy side of the subject. And so, for example, our link with Surrey brings in the Surrey Space Centre and the Centre for Environmental Strategy, as well as some expertise on water supply, which, whereas in Reading we have the Department of Meteorology, which covers weather and climate, but also components of the Earth system, atmospheres, oceans, ice, and so on. The Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences, which has a particular link into soil science and hydrology. Then also the School of Biological Sciences and the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. So you can see it's a very broad range of things covered. And our partners kind of reflect the interest that we have across the groups there. So our cohort we have 12 studentships funded by NERC, but we have a cohort of 17 this year, probably a similar number next year. So that involves people coming in who are funded through slightly different routes or co-sponsorship through various industrial partners and so on. So it's a similar kind of setup to the one that Imperial has, and that's why it's easy for us to work together. Also, at Reading, we have the Walker Institute, which is in many ways parallel to the Grantham Institute and Imperial. So the Walker Institute brings together business partners and academia working in environmental science, but in particular climate change, adaptation and mitigation. Maybe I should introduce at this point. So Maria Noguer, do you want to stand up? She's the business manager for the Walker Institute. And then we have Simon Bailey, who does the equivalent role in the Grantham Institute and for the SSCP DTP. And they also did most of the work in organising today's meeting. Thank you. So probably enough background on the DTPs. Let's get down to business and what the purpose of today is. So the challenges and the way we've organised the meeting are those that have been identified as the grand challenges or societal challenges by NERC in their most recent strategy. So benefiting from natural resources, and we'll have speakers speaking to that topic from business, policy, and then academia. And then and similarly in the second two sessions on resilience to environmental hazards. So, for example, extreme weather, flooding, and many other hazards that face society, not just in the UK, but across the world, I should say. And then managing environmental change, which very much brings in climate change as well. And the core of the day will be actually the lunchtime, when we'll have a poster session. The posters are presented primarily by the first year students who are in these new DTPs. So they're not very far into their PhD, but it'll give you an idea of the kind of projects they're doing, the partners they're interacting with, where they're going. So it's all very much forward-looking. And while you're there, you can discuss ways that you might be involved with, all sorts of activities in these universities going forward. And so please do come and discuss that with us. And if you have any questions afterwards, please contact Joe or myself or the teams at the DTPs. So I think we'll move on and start with the first set of presentations. So actually Joe's going to chair the first session. So I'll hand over to you, Joe.
So as John's described, we've got 3 speakers under the headings for each of these different sessions. The first session is benefiting from natural resources. And we have Andy Wales, who's Director of Sustainable Development at SABMiller. We have Miranda Kavanagh, who's Executive Director of Evidence at the Environment Agency. And Elizabeth Robinson, who's Professor of Environmental Economics, at the University of Reading. So can I ask Andy to give the first presentation? At the end of the presentations, we're going to invite all the speakers to come up to the table for discussion and questions.
Morning, thank you very much for the invitation. Try and figure out how to put this without covering myself in water. It's great to be here. A little bit of an introduction, because SABMiller is not the best-known consumer brand in the world. We're a beer business based in the UK. We also do some soft drinks, but operating in 40 countries around the world and a few more in some joint ventures. About 5 or 6 or 7 in terms of market capitalisation on the FTSE 100, depending what Lloyds Bank and AstraZeneca are doing at that time. And most importantly, perhaps, a business that is built around local beer brands. And in fact, it was interesting, I didn't get it in time to put it into my deck this morning, but The Economist yesterday tweeted that the kind of world of lager, and it goes around the world and looks at the kind of biggest lager in different countries around the world, and actually probably a good half of those are our beers. And they're kind of lagers, perhaps the most nationalistic of consumer products. If you think about a beer, you think about a country pretty much straight away. And Frank Zappa, I think, said it, what you need to be a country is an airline and a beer. And so I guess that's part of our motto as a business. So what I wanted to talk about was how, for a business that operates in all those different markets and a whole range of different contexts, how natural resources frames our value chain and frames our strategy going forwards. And first and foremost, the majority of our valuation as a business, about $80 billion, is from the growth path that we see for emerging and developing countries. About 80% of our income comes from developing and emerging markets. And of course, the majority of that valuation for us is driven by the aspiration of consumers in those markets as they become wealthier, the aspiration for their quality of life. And that's a critical thing driving the valuation of most of the consumer products businesses you know, Unilever, SABMiller, Diageo, a whole range of others. But of course, that sits in the context that if we don't crack the resource challenge that our value chains depend on, that valuation won't, that future value won't occur. And so actually the scale of the resource risks that we see, particularly water supply in the context of climate change, in the context of the water, food, energy nexus through our agricultural supply chains, are actually business critical if we want to obtain that growth to 2020, 2030 and beyond. And we call our work in this area, which is embedded in all of our business strategy and business plans, Prosper. And that's because the message around sustainability needs to be an upbeat one. It needs to be one that inspires citizens and consumers. It needs to be one that inspires the whole of our 18,000 employees around the world to want to do this because it will make them feel good, make them think they're part of a business that's actually trying to contribute to the challenges around them. And so that thing is actually a second part of our company's purpose. Our purpose is to bring refreshment and sociability, build livelihoods and help communities. And that's genuinely integral at the core of our strategy. And I was asked to speak in the context of, oh, I'm pressing the wrong thing, that's why. Laser only, there you go. Good to know, thanks. And so when we were redeveloping our approach to sustainability last year, actually, we had some interesting conversations with those that run our operations, that run our brands around the world, our marketing, those that run human resources. And they all said a similar thing, actually led by the operations teams, which was please make this positive and aspirational. We know the science about climate change. We understand what you're saying about water scarcity. We know what all of that means and how bad it could be, but please actually to get us involved, tell us the positive side and show us what we can do. And so that's where this comes from. This is our kind of aspiration as a business to be part of a world in 2020, 2030 and beyond that's like this. And obviously it connects very closely to where the discussion's going around the Sustainable Development Goals this year, up to September in UN, and then of course in Paris in December as well. And so I'm going to talk mainly about the dip into the three on the right. Resilient, which is about water, clean, which is waste and carbon, and productive, which is agriculture and land. But obviously the two on the left are also critically important for us. Thriving is about job creation and how we drive job creation through our value chains by having a more smart way of involving small business people from small retailers through to farmers. In Africa, we employ about 20,000 people, but the job multiplier is about 1 million jobs. So actually, if we can improve that, then we can have a big development impact. And on a social world, pretty obviously, because we're an alcohol business primarily, we need to scale up our work on alcohol responsibility, and in particular, how we kind of communicate credibly to all of our consumers that moderate consumption of beer is actually a good thing. And it's also a good thing for our long-term growth, and that's what we'd like to see. But I'll focus on the three on the right, if that's okay with you. And I was asked to do it in the context of product development. So just to give a slightly different frame to the presentation. This isn't obviously all that we do on product development, but from a resource perspective, these are some of the key issues. And beer is a very, very simple product. You can split it into the liquid, the packaging, and then the system that it all sits in. And so there's all sorts of efforts across our business, in our different parts of the business, looking at how we respond to environmental change in terms of the liquid, which is about either looking at alternative crops, if our crops are threatened, looking at how we make existing crop regions more sustainable. I'll talk about that. New barley varieties, and then, of course, how we brew. There's a whole, you'd be surprised at how much of the carbon footprint of a beer is in the pack, the glass bottle that you might drink from, and I'll talk through that. And then, of course, there's the whole piece around the system. And the fact that a third of our emissions in our value chain are actually from the refrigeration of product before you buy it to consume it, because it's nice and cold, so you enjoy it. So and the person who pays for that energy, of course, is the retailer, often a small retailer in our business around the world. And so how do we help them reduce their costs significantly whilst also reducing their emissions? So you can think of kind of system interventions in different ways, and as I go through it, hopefully you'll see how we're seeking to change our business and our value chain through some of these intervention points. So let's start with water. So our vision is a resilient world where we have access to water alongside the communities next door to us that need it. And we're under no illusions that if the water's scarce, then it's not going to be the multinational company that gets that water. In fact, we had an interesting case in one of our African markets a few years ago where our business invested in a new water pipeline, which supplied us, the presidential palace, and the main hospital. And you can guess who the water never quite got to, us, which is right. So therefore, we have to think in a creative way about how we engage in this. And so the first thing is around secure water supplies, and how we've got quite a significant investment in very detailed analysis, site by site around the world. We're about half of the way through it at the moment. You essentially spend a week in each brewery with a whole range of local stakeholders, with local government representatives, with quite smart local academics and consultants who can inform us about groundwater and the kind of water environment. And out of that, come up with a plan to deal with what the shared risks are. Obviously, in addition to that, within our own brewery, we need to be very efficient. And so we've already, between 2008 and last year, come down 25%. And we're going to do another improvement to 2020 through our beers. And CSDs are carbonated soft drinks, so typically a Coke. We're a Coke bottler. And then also, and perhaps the most difficult part, is the agriculture piece. How do we work with farmers in a way that helps them grow their yield, improve their income, but of course, tackle the water risks that they face? So that's the kind of the frame for our work on water. And I mean, we've been very successful on the water side. Probably it's saved us $40 million, improving our water efficiency 25% over the last 6 years. But that's actually the much smaller part of the story. It's a brilliant piece of work by the guys that lead our breweries, but it's a small part of the story. The much more important piece is how we work with the communities. And so on the left there, you can see a photo of a farmer in Rajasthan in India around our brewery in a place called Ruchi's. And we have, the business is dramatically more water efficient there than it used to be. It's achieved some good goals. It also recharges into aquifer more than it uses each year through a series of check dams that it's developed with local NGOs. But that's not enough, actually, to secure their water supply. The much more important piece is to work with the smallholder farmers around the brewery and the watershed who use water in an incredibly inefficient way, but are quite poor. And so we've had quite a successful program. In fact, the University of Birmingham and the Cambridge Program for Industry and Sustainability investigated this a couple of years ago and looked at how we work with those farmers to help them choose their crop types, obviously their different farming methods, applying chemicals and so on. And we found actually that through kind of smart cropping, they could actually reduce their water use by about 30% and improve their yield by about 25%, and their income by about 21% at that point. So it's actually, there are some quite significant win-wins which secure our business as well as improving income for the local communities. On the right, you see a cow. This is the paramowing around Bogota. It's the uplands, semi-tropical area around Bogota. And we've, a couple of years ago, faced quite a significant challenge because our water prices in the brewery in the Bogota region were spiking quite rapidly, from a low base, but going up. And we talked with the water company and found out that it was because of soil runoff into the rivers because of poor land management. So we worked with the Nature Conservancy, with the water company of Bogota and some others, to put in place a scheme working with, again, quite poor farmers, to help them to put in riparian barriers in the water courses and to change the types of cows they were using. And actually, they now have less cows, but a higher milk yield in a much smarter area of farming. And the runoff into the river is decreasing dramatically. Now, all of this that kind of thinking takes, from my experience in business, quite smart, creative people to come up with those systems approaches. And one of the things that we often don't have in business, we have a lot of smart people, but we don't often have people with a lot of patience. And one of the challenges is that we're all used to solving a problem like a water supply problem by putting in a 3-month, £3 million reverse osmosis system that we know how to do, and we run the project, and done, and it's done. Actually, these conversations take years, as you probably all know, and involve a whole range of partners, and involve the local community beginning to trust you a bit more. And so the skill that you need in a business to manage those engagements around natural resources is actually quite different. So one of our biggest challenges, and I think NGOs, donors, and others face the same challenges. How do you equip the people who are leading some of these programs to engage with the outside world in a different way? And they're kind of micro examples, I guess, but those things on their own, even if lots of companies, us and Unilever and everyone else do them, are not going to be big enough to affect the scale of the water challenge. What we also need to do is stuff at quite a big scale. And so this is work that we've led with the government of South Africa, with the Department of Water Affairs, with 3 successive ministers now, and two heads of department, which is building a coalition of South African businesses that are quite serious about understanding the risk that water scarcity and water quality issues create for their business in the future, and then investing in certain projects around agricultural water use, around municipal leakage, and around how we improve our own water efficiency in our businesses to tackle some of the scale of the water challenge, the water gap that South Africa faces, which you can see on the left. And if you haven't read this, it's quite an interesting report that we did with the IFC and McKinsey in 2009 called Charting Our Water Future, which looks at different parts of the world and the demand-supply gap on water and the economic impact of that and what companies can do in response. So that's water. The second one I wanted to cover is clean world, carbon. And so there's obviously the cost benefit of action here is much more significant than water, which is typically quite low priced. And so for us, we're probably saving about $100 million a year at the moment in terms of the reduction of energy use in our own business and in the value chain. And you'd be surprised, I think, at the scale of the opportunity that major companies face on resource productivity. I mean, when I was starting out in my career in the late 90s, in the early Blair governments, resource productivity and the decoupling of economic growth from environmental impact was discussed quite a lot as a great opportunity. And because it didn't deliver within 5 years, everyone thought, well, actually, maybe that's not such a good strategy. But the issue is there's a big delay before that kind of thinking feeds into how a business then acts. And it's only now, if I look around the consumer goods companies, that I can see the engineers and the plant managers making quite big improvements through understanding how they can, through their job every day, reduce emissions. So we're actually on a pretty good path. Since 2009, we've reduced absolute emissions 30% in our breweries. And that's saved us quite a significant amount of money. We're going to go further. And as you see, we're now extending it across the value chain. And the biggest challenge there is refrigeration, as I said, and also packaging. And I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the biggest challenges we face, which is perhaps not the most interesting challenge in the world, but it's important for us, which is the consumer perception of packaging. And this is why. So in 50% of the product that we sell around the world goes around in a returnable glass bottle that's used around 40 times. If you're under 40 in the UK, you won't have any memory of that happening here. But if you're over 40, you might have a vague memory of some kind of soft drinks that your milkman might have brought around. But actually, the carbon footprint for recycled one-way glass versus a returnable glass bottle is dramatically different, as you can see there. A returnable glass bottle is about 8.6 kgs per hectolitre, 100 litres of beer, compared to 54 kgs for a one-way pack in one-way glass that does get recycled at whatever the prevailing recycling rate is for brown or green glass in that country. So it's a dramatic difference. And the problem is, of course, that in the kind of general public and consumer perception, recycling seems just about as good as reuse, and sometimes even slightly better. And the big challenge for us is that it's obviously a cost saving for us and other stages of the value chain to use a bottle again and again. But the challenge is the different parts of the value chain. Small retailers who have to collect these bottles back and then send them back to us or swap them when we bring new beers, find it a bit of a pain in the arse because they have to store all these glass bottles in their small stores. Consumers think, well, does it look as premium as a one-way glass bottle? And our marketing teams think, can't we could innovate more fast. We could rapidly change our portfolio and offer consumers something that looks different and snazzy if we're able to change the bottle fleet quicker. And actually, that kind of debate about the economics versus the perception is right at the heart of how we're grappling with dealing with resource challenges in our value chain. And then the final one is a productive world, which is around land use, food security, and the crops that we need to brew beer. And so obviously, lots of companies have set goals to have their sourcing sustainable by 2020. But what that really means is to have their sourcing meeting a pretty good set of standards like Rainforest Alliance or the Fair Trade Foundation or some kind of organic certification. What it doesn't mean actually is that those companies have really thought through the total available resource in that area, the resource they need for their value chain, and they've figured out what their proportion might be. And so what we're trying to do instead is do that work, is to set goals per crop, per growing region, to really consider the kind of environmental resource that each of our crops are grown in, and then look at what targets we need to set ourselves to get there. And two examples, one is sugarcane, which is the kind of standards approach, and that's because sugarcane has quite big, potentially quite big child labour challenges, which is we don't have in ours, which is good because we've got things like the Bon Sucre certification in Honduras. But that's the bigger challenge there. On barley, it's more irrigation. And so in South Africa, we've worked with WWF and a range of other organisations on a programme called Better Barley, Better Beer. And in its first year, which was 2 years ago, it moved from kind of pivot irrigation to more targeted irrigation and cut water use by 40% for the same yield. And again, they were probably farmers, to be honest, who thought that they'd probably done most of the work on efficiency, and they knew what they were doing, and there probably wasn't a huge gain to make. And so this is why I have quite a lot of faith. We need to do other things as well, but quite a lot of faith in the scale of the resource productivity opportunity in business value chains. I guess one other interesting angle on the farming piece is the work we're doing to localize farming production. So typically, and bizarrely, in beer in Africa, beer is typically sold to middle-income consumers using barley imported from Europe or Canada, because that's the place you can grow barley to that quality historically. And so we've got quite a big strategy, which is called Go Farming, quite simple, which is looking at how you can either localize barley production, or you can use crops like cassava or sorghum, working with local small farmers to create high-quality clear lagers that can then be sold locally. And interestingly, the most successful country we've done this in, we started in 2002 with sorghum in Uganda, and Eagle beer there now is the biggest beer in the market. And Uganda's got quite a low official alcohol consumption. But actually, they're one of the highest consumers of alcohol in the world per head. It's just that the vast majority of it is illicit and homebrew and quite dangerous. And so this is also aligning with why our government departments are going in terms of health and excise and everything else to create a new excise pool. And it's one of the most fast-growing parts of our business. We launched the first cassava-based lager in Mozambique 3 years ago, and we're now taking that to Ghana and Zambia and elsewhere. And the total farming jobs there at the moment, probably from just those small beers, are probably 40 to 50,000 small farmers who were previously subsistence, and that will grow as we go forward. And then the very final slide was just to talk about some work that we did with WWF that we launched at Davos last year, because we tried to look at the water-food energy nexus and how that might play into policy, because we sit right in the middle of that as a business that uses water, that buys a lot of energy, that grows often quite involved in agriculture in the markets that we operate in. And we basically came up with this kind of three-phase level of thinking about how we start with the resource endowments, we look at then the uses of those resources, and we look at how that feeds into the political imperatives. And what this helps us do is when we're engaging with governments to talk about how they might improve governments for sustainability, obviously what they really want is the stuff at the top. They really want the output in terms of growth, development, and sustainability overall. The resources should underpin that. And so it's helped us map out how we engage with governments in different ways to align where they would like to go and take the quality of life and the growth for their country with that resource underpinning. That was it from me. Thank you.
Miranda, we'll be taking questions at the end for all three presentations.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. I was just musing on the fact that I think Andy's got the dream job, which involves beer and sustainability. What's not to like about that? I was very glad to be asked today because in the Environment Agency, for reasons which I hope will become apparent as I give my talk, we're very keen on collaborating with other partners on some of the challenges and questions that we face, which are considerable in all our areas of work. Today I'm going to focus on the natural resources challenge, and I'm specifically going to take the example of fracking. But at the end of what I have to say, I'm going to talk a little bit about our partnership working as well. So the other thing is I feel like a bit of a fraud because this was billed as a policy slot, and I have to make it clear that we don't do policy. The policy framework is set by DEFRA. In the specific instance I'm going to be talking about today of fracking, it's set by DEC, advised by the Committee on Climate Change about the alignment with the Climate Change Act. Instead, what we do is we deliver on a policy framework set by DEFRA. We have the functions shown on this slide. There are 7 different functions. We have 3 different roles. So we regulate industry in order to make them more sustainable and minimise the harm done to the environment. We advise government, industry and others on sustainability issues. We carry out operational work. I'm sure you'll be aware of the work we do on flood defence, flood risk management, and also on biodiversity. So we have those 3 roles. Within each of those roles and each of the functions shown on the slide, there's an awful lot of science, evidence, and everything else that underpins it. It's very, very technical. So, for example, if I pick on pollution control, within that we are looking at major industry under the Industrial Emissions Directive. We're looking at conventional waste, discharges to surface water, discharges to groundwater, radioactive substances and contaminated land. We have about 10,250 staff at the moment and an annual budget of about £1 billion or so, some of which comes from charges from the industries that we regulate. And everything we do is underpinned by scientific evidence and principles and data. The Evidence Directorate, which is the bit that I work in, we've lifted a line from our corporate plan in the Environment Agency, so we talk about evidence to guide and inspire our actions and those of others. And we have a philosophy and a vision that everything we do must be underpinned by compelling evidence. So some of the work we do is looking at what are the best interventions to make, the most effective interventions to make, and where to make them in the environment. Sometimes we have to come up with what you might call inconvenient truths and challenge decision-making where we feel it isn't underpinned by evidence. We also look at what the optimum outcome might be for the environment, and we help with decision-making, looking at that. We also review existing programs and look at new programs from an evidential point of view. As this session is about benefiting from natural resources, what I want to talk about is how evidence underpins the way we look at natural resources and how it makes it more sustainable. And as I say, I'm going to talk about fracking in particular. So how we deliver evidence in my directorate. So we collaborate with others, which I've mentioned, and that's why I wanted to be here today, including research councils in universities. We look at the gaps and the research needed to fill evidence gaps. We help the Environment Agency to develop clear positions on each of its tasks, which can be used publicly, and make sure they're evidence-based, which is particularly important if they are ever challenged. We provide various outputs ranging from reports to new tools and screening methods. We deliver support on the ground for our operational field staff who are based all over the country in 16 different areas, because if you're going to deliver services to the environment and to people, you have to deliver it locally. We advise on the effectiveness of regulation. And this is particularly important at the moment because everything we do is very scrutinised by the government from a value for money point of view, so we have to justify what we're doing, and that has to be evidence-based. And we use particular frameworks to deliver evidence. So we use a source pathway receptor approach to protecting people and the environment from pollutants. We use a driver's pressures state impact response approach to looking at the state of the environment. And we take a risk-based approach and look at the costs and the benefits. And on the picture, you've got both a drought and a flood situation. So what we do can change on one particular resource. In the case of water, having either too little or too much, what we do has to be flexible and adaptable. And the situation can change month by month or even over a shorter time frame. So the role of the Environment Agency with regard to natural resources. So we have to check that the benefits are sustainable, by which I mean that we have to look at the impact on people, we have to look at the interplay between one resource and another. And evidence is needed for all of this. So for each type of resource shown on this slide, I've got some user activities that are shown against them for water, food and energy on the left, the user activities in the middle, and then the sort of topics that we need to look at and we need to have information about. And we need to be able to access good quality science about the topics shown on the right-hand side. So today we're going to talk about shale gas, and this raises several evidence needs, which I'll be going through. So, shale gas and hydraulic fracturing is a very high-profile topic and has been for some time. Although we've had onshore oil and gas in the UK for 50 years, and some of it, I think the population is not really aware of it, we haven't had anything like this. This is enabling a natural resource that was previously inaccessible in shale rocks under the ground to be accessible through the technique of hydraulic fracturing. I'm sure you'll be aware of the very rapid growth of this technique in the United States and the questions that this has posed about the impacts on the environment and the impacts of hydrocarbons. And another issue in the States is that they didn't measure the baseline levels of pollutants in the environment, so I think they don't necessarily have a very clear picture of what's going on, but there is anecdotal evidence, and there have been various films and videos and so on that have created a very bad impression of this as a technique. Some parts of the UK have reserves, for example, the shale rocks, the Bowland shale rocks in the north of England. And in the past several years, we've been approached with a number of applications to make exploratory development of these reserves. And it's particularly important in this area that we make sure we make it very clear that our decision making is evidence-based. So what is the size of the prize? There are different reports about this. So this is just one report from the Institute of Directors. And the blue on the map shows the areas covered by a strategic environmental assessment for new onshore oil and gas. And the estimate from the IOD was that it could supply 1/3 of the UK's gas demand at peak production. And this could have a positive impact on energy security and jobs and tax revenues. However, this is a schematic of the environmental risks associated with this. So on the surface, you've got storage tanks and the production platform. And the gas, as you may be aware, is extracted back up the well to the surface by flowback waters and gases. And there are a number of risks. So there's a risk to environmental media with air, land, and water. Substances, chemicals, radioactive substances coming out. The distances to local infrastructure, either at a local scale or at a regional scale if you had sufficient critical mass of this industry in any one area, like the northwest of England, for example. The time scale, so it would take seconds perhaps for odours from this activity to reach sensitive receptors, and maybe decades for the impact to be felt in, for example, groundwater. So the potential risks moving clockwise from the top, so water resources, that's to do with water that could be diverted from other needs to the needs of hydraulic fracturing. Air quality, so pollutants from perhaps flaring off the gas or also combustion, dust and odours. Greenhouse gases, methane, fugitive methane emissions. Leaks from transportation of gas off-site for processing or distribution. Potential inadequate treatment of wastewaters. Contamination of the surface soil, perhaps, and surface water, including aquifers, by chemicals from drilling. The contamination of groundwater as well, either through fractures propagating from the shale layer into the aquifer or from poor well design. And then finally, radioactive materials, and then also earth tremors from fracking. So there's a huge range of challenges posed by this activity that we have to regulate for. So there have been some scientific reports about what the impact might be and whether the risks can be managed. And this was the view of the Royal Society in its report, that the risks can be managed effectively. And it has to be properly regulated, not least of all because there could be lack of public acceptance of it if it isn't properly regulated. However, there are some knowledge gaps which I've listed at the bottom of the slide. Some areas where we still don't know all the answers. So groundwater, air quality, and also the translation into a UK context. We can learn so much from the US picture, but the geology, the underlying geology, is different in the UK, and also the scale of the country is obviously different, and the density of population. So this is a slide about shale exploration and groundwater. Why does groundwater matter? Well, because 30% of water in this country comes from groundwater. In the southeast, that rises to 70%, so it's very important. So the grey maps show some of the, in the black boxes are the exploration licenses, blocks where the exploration licenses are being sought. And the red zones on the grey maps are groundwater source protection zones. So these are zones where groundwater flows to drinking water supply wells. So you can see that there is a coincidence between some of these exploration zones, the black blocks, and the red zones, which are the groundwater protection, source protection zones. So through the planning process and also through our permitting regimes, we can control some of these activities. And then we also have brought out a new edition of our groundwater vulnerability map, which is the bottom right-hand map, the very colourful map. And this map shows our understanding of the properties of the soils and rocks across England and how they will affect the transport of pollutants from the surface. So the maps provide a key tool for us in our screening of some of these applications and show us where the vulnerability of groundwater is. And these tools and also the knowledge of scientists in the Environment Agency will enable us to understand this and manage this challenge. However, there is another risk from what comes up from the shale rocks under the ground as opposed to what is on the surface. And that's what my next slide is about. So we were the first to produce an estimated map of the subsurface extent of the shales. If you look at the top left-hand map, this is something that we produced with the British Geological Survey, the BGS, and it shows you the depth of different rock surfaces in the country. And then the maps on the right-hand side show, we calculated from that the depth of the base of the principal aquifers of sandstone, that's A, and the depth from that to the top of any underlying shale formation. And then you get C, which is the vertical separation depth between the base of the aquifer and the top of the shale unit. And the vertical separations are of the order of about 1 kilometre between the top of the shale and the base of the aquifers. And the central yellow colour shows separations of 1.6 kilometres. So this is interesting, but it does have its limitations and uncertainties. So the maps are based on the standard resolution of the British Geological Survey mapping, and we use these for a preliminary risk assessment and a general understanding. And we're hoping to extend this approach to cover other features such as other hydrocarbon formations, coal measures, and so on. But this information is freely available on the BGS website if any of you are interested in it. So we've looked at water above and below ground. Now for what's going on with the air. So this shows you 4 selected air quality issues I've chosen to focus on. So flares. So we're investigating different flare designs. I've put a cross on the flare shown on the top left because we don't think open flares are best available technique for these sorts of installations. We think that enclosed flares are better. Hydrocarbons, so for example, that affect health, such as benzenes, and the climate, such as methane. And we're looking at how we monitor these, how we quantify them, and how we control them. Dust, the shale gas operations can generate dust by wind erosion of stockpiles, for example. And there's an impact on people's health and or their enjoyment of local amenities through this. And we've developed a directional passive sampler, which I'll say a little more about later on, which we've invented it and patented it in order to be able to measure this better. Other examples of amenity risks are also noise, visible plumes, and odour. Regional impact, I mentioned that in passing earlier on. If you have a lot of these sorts of installations in one area, and the area shown there is northwest England, for example, then you could have a regional effect. That the Bowland shales are the ones up there. You could have a regional effect, which we are not exactly sure what the impact would be, and so we're looking at that, and we have to monitor that and work out how we would control that. And one other thing to mention is that in the US, there were concerns about increased levels of ozone with this, photochemical ozone. So we're investigating that also as a potential environmental risk. So that was all I wanted to say about the sorts of challenges we face with this particular natural resource. I could go through a whole lot of other risks with other natural resources, but that's a sort of typical example in a very live issue, because we're actively working on this at the moment, and we have to come up with the answers in the next few years, because this is now a very much a developing area, and it's an area that I think the government is keen on in terms of energy security. So my next slide is to talk about some partnerships and some work we're doing with universities to develop some of our new evidence. And they're either partnerships involving students or fellows. So we have a NERC Environment Agency Fellowship with Lancaster University, and this is looking at nitrate pollution from agriculture. Nitrate vulnerable zones, the picture on the bottom left. This is as required by the European Nitrates Directive. Agriculture is the main source of nitrate, as half of the nitrogen in fertilizers and manures is lost with water runoff. I was interested to hear actually from Andy's presentation that this is a problem elsewhere in the world. So we're at risk of nitrogen pollution, and we're at risk of being unable to meet our obligations under certain European directives if we don't tackle this. So this partnership is looking at how we can monitor and model this, and then what measures we can take in order to be able to control it more. A PhD studentship in collaboration with Hull University on early warning and detection for invasive species. So you have the invasive quagga mussel up there, but there are other invasive species such as the invasive shrimp and also the marbled crayfish. So this is a partnership looking at how to detect and also survey the numbers of these invasive species using eDNA. The NERC EA Fellowship in Atmospheric Inputs to Sensitive Catchments is shown up there. And this is under the Habitats Directive and also the UK's biodiversity commitments. We have to ensure that these sensitive habitats are maintained in favourable conditions or returned to such condition. This fellowship is looking at new evidence on the response of habitats to atmospheric nitrates and ammonia inputs. And then the directional passive air sampler, which I mentioned before, which is shown on the bottom right-hand side. Conventional air quality monitors don't resolve between different wind directions and also need meteorological measurements to do this and require a power source. This is a very simple little device is able to do this without that, and we patented it, and we're trialling it at different sites such as a steelworks and a water transfer station, anaerobic digester and so on. So those are just some examples of the sorts of things that we are doing, and we're anxious to do more. And we've also identified the key research questions we're interested in each of the areas that we're working on, and we've produced this collaborative research questions document. A colleague of mine, Neil Weatherly, I can't see him at the moment, is in the audience. If you are interested in these questions, he's brought a couple of the documents with him, and he can show them to you in the break. So, the vision for evidence is that it should be the calm centre of the storm. This was particularly relevant approximately a year ago. We were in the middle of a very challenging situation with the extreme winter flooding that we had and the situation we had on the Somerset Moors and Levels. and we had the media camped outside the office on the pavement, and all sorts of things going on, high political interest, and so this is how I would have liked it to have been, because it's central to the process. We provide clarity, we try and remain calm in the face of nearby turbulence in the form of enormous media and political pressure. We're based on science, we focus on risk and so on. So this is really what we need. We need good data and robust research. It is often challenged and indeed can end up in court. When I was at the bar, I specialised in judicial review, and you didn't get very many of them, but nowadays it's become a massive industry, so we have to make sure that what we're doing is capable of standing up and is evidence-based. And much of what we need, I think, can be found by working in partnership with other people and the next generation of environmental scientists. So it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I'll be happy to take questions later on. Thank you.
Elizabeth.
So hi, thank you to Maria for inviting me to talk here. I'm not a scientist. I think I'm a wannabe scientist. I have an engineering degree from a long time ago, but now I'm an economist. And so I was a little unsure about whether I should be here talking to you. But then I thought, yes, I should definitely be here talking to you. So I noticed I just grabbed this from Maria. I noticed that the brochure, and I thought to myself, it says responding to environmental change. And there's lots of environmental change there, but there's not much responding. And so what I work on is the interface and people and natural resources. So I sort of think about who's going to do the responding and who's driving some of that environmental change, and it's the people. So what I'm trying to give you is an economist's perspective on some of these issues. Okay, the animation is on, which means all these are going to come separate and drive me up the wall. So I'll try and get them up first. Bear with me. So firstly, I'm an academic and I'm an economist, so I'm going to have really horrible visuals and really sort of fuzzy graphs and very little data. I'm an applied theorist. But what I will talk about is what I just wanted to give was 2 insights into how scientists and social scientists, so academic scientists and social scientists, are working together, hopefully, to improve our ability to benefit from natural resources. And so what I'm going to talk about is 2 projects that I'm working on. And one is NERC funded, and it's working on the agriculture-forest interface. We're working in Ethiopia and Ghana, but I'll just talk a little bit about the cocoa side from Ghana. And the other project is funded by the Swedish SIDA agency, and it's looking at marine protected areas and managing fisheries. And so these are just 2 examples of social scientists working with scientists. So what underlies the talk? Well, firstly, that we can increase the benefits we get from our natural resources if we understand how to manage them better. And I suppose in the past, there hasn't been so much need to actively manage the resource base just because there's been fewer pressures. There's been less climate variability, and there's often been lower population density. But as those pressures grow, the need for better management grows. And often those pressures are growing faster than our ability to adapt to the changes. And that's particularly true when we get population surges, and it's particularly true when we get increasing climate variation. And so perhaps we can better benefit from our natural resource base if scientists and social scientists are working better together. And what's nice is that, I don't know if Maria just needed another talk or if she thought that might be an interesting point too, that I've been invited to talk on that. And what's nice as well is in the NERC project that I'm doing, it's very much social science funded, but there's a large component of social scientists in the project. And on the CEDAR project, it's a social science project, but we're working very much with the marine scientists. So the question about the chocolate, what are we asking? The question we are asking, and it's a big 3-year question, but it's can farmers intensify their cocoa production without irreversibly damaging the ecosystem? And so that's what we started off with. And this is about as technical as any of my graphs ever get. And people who've seen me lecture before know that I only consider graphs, lines to do one thing. Lines curve upwards or lines curve downwards, and they're either straight or they're curved. And every time I talk to DEFRA, that's the only graph I show. It might have different axes, and the curves might be different, but that's all that really matters to me. So why do I think this is an interesting graph? And why is it useful? This is actually the graph that we put in our proposal for this project. And we think it says quite a lot. And it certainly allows us scientists and social scientists to work together. So farmers choose the intensity of their agriculture. Those are constrained choices. They may not be able to afford to intensify. They may not have the ability to intensify. But if they can choose the intensity of their agriculture, there's some impact on the ecosystems. And so what we're asking is, what is that relationship between the intensity of the agricultural production and the ecosystem services? And what we're concerned about is the lower curve. What if farmers, as they intensify their agriculture, start to damage the ecosystem around them, and the ecosystem services fall over time as the intensity of agriculture increases? We're going to be worried. But what if farmers can intensify their agriculture and, at the same time, have very little damage on the ecosystem services? We're interested in how those lines curve because we're interested in whether there's tipping points or not. So we're interested in the non-linearity of the relationship and if we're going to hit a tipping point through the intensification of agriculture. So what the scientists do, what the ecologists do, or what my colleagues are doing, is they're looking for that relationship between the ecosystem service and the intensity. So they're kind of trying to plot one of those yellow lines. What we as social scientists are asking is, why are we on one curve and not the other? Is that driven by science, or is that driven by institutions and society? So one thing, let me just go back a second, sorry. And so what we're arguing is that it might be institutions and social processes that put us on those different curves. So where are we working? Well, this is Ghana where we're working. It's an integrated agriculture forest landscape. And the dark green areas are the protected area, and the green areas are where there's cocoa being produced near to the forest. And what are the scientists doing? The scientists are producing transects, and we're doing all kinds of I feel like it's us when we're out there in the field, but they're looking at some of the very, very sort of formal ecological issues. So what are the ecosystem services, and how can we measure them? What's important to the scientists and the social scientists is the distance to the forest and the forest fragments and how that matters. So space is very much an important part of the research. How those forest areas are managed also matters, and that's where the social scientists, the economists, and the anthropologists come in. And what we find is the management is driven by individual farmers on their own farms actively, but indirectly through social structures and institutions. So this is how, what we had before was the scientist view of the forest, if you like. We have some satellite imagery, and we can do some transects, but we can also talk to the people. And so when we ask the farmers how the cocoa farm and how their location influence their relationship with the natural resource base, they will draw us maps. Maps of where they live, maps of where roads are, maps of where water sources are, and maps of the forest. And so that's our local villagers' perspective of how they interact with the resource base. And so farmers may perceive their relationships with the resource base differently. So what do social scientists do? We ask the farmers and the villagers what their perceptions are of the ecosystems. What are we measuring? Well, we don't measure like scientists measure. I'm an economist, so I do try and collect some quantitative data. But my colleagues, my anthropology colleagues, my development specialists will collect what I'm not rudely calling stories. Stories and narratives about the relationship with the natural resource base. So, this is what the scientists are doing. Lots of measuring the production of leaves, roots, and stems. There's some wonderful science, some wonderful real ecological science going on in Ghana at the moment and in Ethiopia with my colleagues. What they're trying to do, I can't walk away from the microphone, can I? But I can point, maybe. What they're trying to do is plot some of these points to create these curves. They're trying to measure the intensity of the agriculture And that way we might talk about how much water management is actively occurring, how much fertilizer is being put on the land, how much of that is organic, how much is inorganic. So basic farm management. And then they're looking at the ecosystem services that are being provided by the ecosystem. So it might be leaf fall. It might be pollination services coming from a nearby forest. And so we're measuring pollinators, we're catching pollinators, we're looking at the number of birds, bird counts, types of birds there are. We're looking at natural pests and diseases, we're looking at natural predators. A lot of measurement going on. We're measuring the size of our trees. This is collecting leaf fall, width of trees. And here we're looking at the roots, and we've developed some little contraptions so we can figure out what's going on with the root growth of our cocoa plants. A lot of measurement. Social scientists, we sort of sit down and chat. So we sit down and talk to people. What we're trying to understand is why farmers behave in the way they do. So we can measure how much fertilizer they use, and we can measure whether they are trying to ensure that they have good soil fertility. But we can also try to understand why, and we can do that in several ways. We can ask them, and we can also look at the institutions. One of the institutions that's particularly important is property rights. If you're a farmer and you're deciding how to manage your cocoa farm, you can make a decision to very actively manage the soil structure, look after your soils, use inorganic and organic fertilizer. Or you can decide that's quite expensive and quite time-consuming, and so your alternative is to plant your cocoa, run down your patch, and then go and find another plot of land, chop down the trees there, and start planting your cocoa again. Whether you can do that or not depends on the property rights over the land, whether there is some forested land that you can go to and claim, whether you're allowed to claim that land, whether you can get implicit property rights or not. And so what we find is we get a lot of shift in cultivation when there's forest available, when there's primary forest available, and when there's no one enforcing a property right to that. And when we run out of forest, or when we run out of available forest, then the farmer has a choice. Do I actively manage my soils, or do I run down my soils and move out of farming? And so when we look at our cocoa yields, they depend in part on the ecosystem services that are being provided by being part of a forest agriculture landscape, but they also depend on farmers' perceptions of what options they have and what decisions they can make. Farmers may actively make decisions over the ecosystems and the natural resource base, but they may also have to just accept passively. So for example, if you're near a forest, you can passively benefit from pollination. You might passively have a negative impact from pests and diseases coming from that nearby forest. If someone else decides to chop that forest down, you lose your natural pollination through no fault of your own. Whether someone chops that forest down is going to depend again on their ability, the institutions over land and the enforcement. Maybe there's little active management of the forest, but the community comes together and decides to manage the forest themselves. So again, we're looking for something which we might term social capital. Is there some value to a community coming together, having meetings, actively trying to manage the landscape around it? And we can consider that valuable because if the activities of the village, socially protecting, socially fencing their forest, increases ecosystem services, we can measure that value in terms of, for example, the cocoa yields, which is what we're interested in this project. Okay, pressing the wrong one now. So what do I do? Okay, I do chat with the farmers and I do chat with the villagers. That's to get the story I need. But as an economist, I'm a modeler. I'm a theoretical modeler. And so what I do is I build a theoretical model. And this is the kind of model I build. I turn it into a computer algorithm, but the computer algorithm is really based on something like this. And what I build is a behavioral model, a model of how people behave, how farmers behave. And it's a constrained model. And so what I look at is their labor choices. I look at how they use their labor and how they spend any money they have, and how that's influenced by the people around them, the institutions, and the ecosystem services. What we think is novel about this model is that bioeconomic models are not new. Understanding that when a farmer makes a decision on how to farm, how much capital, how much labor, how much purchased inputs, depends also on the ecosystem services is not particularly new. but combining the bioeconomic model with the institutional framework is quite new. The model's not completed yet because we're 1.5 years through our 3-year NERC project. But this is the thought processes that go on as an economist and how my work would link with these scientists. So, for example, how farmers allocate their labor towards farm activities, working on their cocoa, forest labor, that might be collecting non-timber forest products from the forest. It might also be joining a working group of the village to protect the forest. And wages, if there's off-farm labor, do you allocate some of your labor to working or some of it to working on your own farm? And we tend to assume the farmer has some fixed labor of their own. Maybe they can buy in labor. Maybe they can sell their labor out. Then we have some production functions. The production functions are the transformation of how the farm labor is transformed into farm output, how the forest labor is transformed into non-timber forest products, what one can collect from the forest, and how wage labor transforms into wage income. And within the computer program, these are equations. The wage labor might be quite easy. My income is the amount of time I spend working times the wage. The forest labor might be quite easy. There's probably some relatively simple relationship between how much time I spend in the forest and how much I collect from the forest. What also matters is the distance from the forest, so I have to spend time walking to the forest if I want to use it. The production function here to get to farm output is far more complex, and this is where we can only do this model with the ecology, because some of the inputs are going to be labor, some of the inputs are going to be purchased fertilizer, for example, pesticides, but a lot of the inputs are going to be the ecosystem services. And so this is where the model becomes a bioeconomic model. We've got the biology and the economics. These decisions also depend on the outcome and what happens over time. So, for example, poverty may prevent or constrain farmers from making choices that they would like to do. If you don't have access to credit, you can't purchase the fertilizer that you would like to use to enhance your land. So if you don't have access to credit, you're more likely not to be able to enhance the fertility of your soil, and therefore more likely to move to another area of land if that's available. The institutional context may make sensible choices suboptimal in the long run. So, for example, shifting cultivation makes sense to the individual farmer, but not for the total landscape if it's destructive overall. Farmers may benefit from the pollination services from the nearby forest, but in the short term, they may need to feed their family, and they may need to chop down some trees in the forest to produce charcoal to sell it to a local market, to pay the school fees, to pay the hospital fees. So the institutions determine whether the choices that farmers make, which are optimal from their perspective, are optimal choices for the community as a whole in the short run, the community as a whole in the long run, and for the ecosystem services. So that's the kind of thing as an environmental economist, as an academic environmental economist that I do. We hope that in the end we can say something interesting to policymakers. We hope that with a model that's conceptually simple, and we try to keep the equations as simple as possible, because the point of the model is not to model the system accurately. We're not trying to reproduce the actual system, but we're trying to provide insights into what if we change the property rights laws? What if we worked at enhancing social capital? What if we give farmers access to credit so they can purchase fertilizer? How is that going to change the relationship of the farmers with the ecosystems around them, and therefore the long-run supply of ecosystem services? I spend a lot of my time in front of a computer or with a paper and pencil. The other quick story I wanted to talk about is another project, the one that I'm working on in Tanzania, and this is on fishing. And we came in to look at marine protected areas. So we're talking about offshore fishing in marine areas, and nearshore fishing, and fishing by local fishing people. And we came in as economists in part because we had been talking to the protected area managers. And they sort of said to us, we know a lot about the science. We're doing a lot of good science. We're collecting samples. We're monitoring fish stocks. So we've got a pretty good idea about what the stocks look like. We're monitoring catch, so we've got a pretty good idea about catch. We know a lot about the techniques that are being used to fish. We know what the illegal techniques are. We know there's dynamite fishing. We know people are using mosquito nets to fish. But we don't really understand the people side of it. And so we were asked to come and work with the managers of the marine protected areas to see if we could provide some insights into how the marine protected area could be managed better for biodiversity, for the ecosystem, the marine ecosystem, but also for the fishes. And one thing we were particularly interested in as well was the issue of conflict. So what we were finding was there was a lot of conflict between the fishing people and the fisher communities and the protected area managers. And one of the mandates for the marine protected area managers is to protect the ecosystem, but also to protect the fishers. And they felt they weren't doing very well. They sort of had an idea about, in the long run, as economists and as scientists, we know that in the long run it's possible to have larger stocks and larger offtake if you manage your stocks well, but it wasn't happening. And there was one village we went to in Tanzania, and we were actually warned to be very careful because there'd been violent conflict situations before we got there. And so we did go a little nervously to this village, which was absolutely refusing to cooperate with the marine protected area in any way. I think if you go as a sort of foreign academic, you get forgiven a lot of things. And so we went to the community, and we actually had a really good meeting with them. And we got a lot of, people were very open to us about what was causing conflict. And of course, the frustration for everybody was there was no one who didn't want greater stocks and greater offtake. No one didn't want the fisher people to be better off, and no one didn't want the marine protected area to be in a healthier situation. Everyone would benefit, but we weren't managing to get there. And this is a very small story, but it's not much different really from the story about the cod fisheries. So all my examples come from low and middle income countries, but I think there's still the stories can resonate with what's happening in Europe. So typically efforts to manage fisheries anywhere in the world tend to be precipitated by falling stocks. So the stocks fall, and you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. So it's nearly always a knee-jerk reaction. It's very hard to get people to manage a resource when everything looks okay. It's very hard to find the money to implement the structures and institutions that make sense when you don't really need to because the stock is doing just fine without the pressures on it. In Tanzania, what's been found is that as the fishery gets overfished, the evidence of that is the average catch of the fish gets smaller. So the large fish start to go missing, they disappear from the ecosystem, people start fishing smaller fish. As the average size of a fish gets smaller, you need a smaller net to fish those fish. The smaller nets catch the young juvenile fish, catch the remaining medium-sized fish, you need smaller nets still. What's actually been found is a lot of mosquito nets that are handed out to protect families from mosquitoes are the perfect fishing net. Because guess what? They catch absolutely everything. So if you go fishing with a mosquito net, you will catch something. Your fish might be about this big, but dried and salted, they're really tasty and they're really nutritious. Of course, if you catch everything, because this is a renewable resource, there's no regeneration. And that's pretty much what's happening. And like I say, it's just not uncommon to see the fishing nets. So getting where we want to be. I'm going to say it's relatively straightforward to know where we are, and it's relatively straightforward to know where we want to be. But it's managing the transition that's really tricky. And economists have kind of been our own worst enemy. So why is it hard to manage the transition? Because people are involved. And environmental economists and resource economists often haven't really worried about the people being involved. They've also just worried about the resource itself. So this is generally as far as I go with data. And again, we're going to have the curves. So we all kind of know where we are. We're down here. We've got low catch and low stocks. And we all kind of know where we want to be. We want high stocks, and we want a higher catch, higher offtake. But the question is, how do we get there? So what's the best route? So what have resource economists generally suggested in the past? Resource economists have suggested the best route is to have a moratorium on fishing, so we stop the catch, and the fish stocks recover fastest. And if you do the economics, you can find the solution of no fishing, stocks recover, and then the fishing families can start fishing again. Makes sense. You can do a net present value. You can have some low interest rate. Makes a lot of sense. But if you're a poor fishing family, that is an absolute catastrophe. Because what that says is you will have no income for the next 3-4 years. And so as an applied economist and someone quite a social scientist, what I work on is not so much where we want to be, but it's what we do in that very first year when we decide we need to do something. The optimal thing is to give fishermen large nets with very large meshes, take away all the small mesh, and let the stocks recover with the catch going down and then rapidly increasing. That's what causes the conflict, because if you give a fisherman who's been using a mosquito net a 4 or 6 inch mesh net, they don't catch anything for 5 or 6 years. So, the ecological answer and the rational economics answer is that this is the livelihoods and poverty answer. And the answer is probably to accept that the stocks are going to recover quite slowly, but to allow fishing folk to reach, and I'm not sure that's the best curve, but it was the best I could draw on PowerPoint, to allow the fishing curve to recover slowly as well. So you allow the fishing to continue, and maybe what you do is instead of switching straight away to 6 inch nets, you give fishing folk 1 inch nets for 2 years, then 2 inch nets the next year, then 4 inch nets, and you exchange the nets like that. So that's the kind of questions we are looking at. We talk to the fishing communities for several reasons: to understand what's going on, to understand to what extent they would accept a policy intervention, and we work with the ecologists to ask, what is the impact of changing the fishing gear rules? How rapidly will the stocks recover? How important is it for the stocks to recover fast? What kind of offtake can we allow with a slower recovery? So this all made sense when these slides were just one after the other, and I looked at them upstairs, that we wouldn't get this thing like that. So I think that's all I sort of wanted to say. I hope this gives some insight into why I get very excited working with scientists, because I get the kind of data I really need to do the kind of models I really want to do. I think it hopefully motivates why scientists might find it interesting to work with social scientists and what we can add. What we can add is stories. What we can add is stories that allow one to create models. What we can add is a way to interface the science and the people. And hopefully what we can add is a way for both social scientists and scientists to make it just much more likely that our work will have impact and will be picked up by policymakers, hopefully motivated by policymakers and policy questions to start with, will be picked up by policymakers and is going to be likely to have an impact without causing too much stress and too much conflict for the people as we implement these possible solutions. So thank you.
So my name is Stephanie Goderidge. I work for EDF Energy on a project called Climate on Us. And my question is for Miranda about fracking. So everything you said was very much about the managing the extraction and the risk around that. But it's still a fossil fuel, and we know with the global carbon budget that we are going to have to stop burning fossil fuel at some point, and pretty soon. So even if the extraction is proven to be safe, why are we still looking for fossil fuels?
Thanks. Another question? Yes, in the front here.
Thank you, Ollie Watts from the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. I was also going to ask exactly the same question, but I also have a second part of that for Miranda. You painted quite a complex picture with quite a lot of knowledge gaps in understanding whether we can make fracking safe or not. We all know the appetite of governments generally at the moment is not for regulation, and I'd like to know how confident you think we are that we might be able to develop an effective, safe regulatory framework that actually will be implemented if fracking is to go ahead.
Thank you. Third one in this batch on the left. Thank you.
Derek Gregory, retired from the National Institute for Medical Research, MRC. Several little questions. One directed to Andy Wales. How about giving each customer a bottle so that they can hold on to it, and when they want it refilled, they just simply take it to you. So there's no question of storage on your part or on the anywhere else's part. That's for starters. So put your beer in a large bin or receptor and deliver it bottle by bottle according to the payment. And secondly, are you ready for the less consumption of alcohol, which is the healthy aim? Are you ready for that, which would decrease your business? And you would have to look out to compensate this. One more little thing.
No, two questions is enough.
2 questions.
Thank you. So, Miranda, fracking.
Yes, I'm going to do a massive great duck of the policy issue, I'm afraid, because as I said at the start of my talk, I'm a humble, from a humble delivery body. We don't set the policy framework. DEC set the policy framework with advice from the Committee on Climate Change about whether it's compatible with the Climate Change Act. And what the Committee on Climate Change has said is that as long as the fugitive methane emissions issue is handled properly and also it doesn't impact decarbonisation, then it can go ahead. So that's not for the Environment Agency. On the regulatory framework against a backdrop of an extremely complex picture, we are confident that we can regulate this so as to manage the risks in the way that they need to be managed. The industry at the moment is in an exploratory phase, it's not in a production phase. So we believe we can manage the risks in the exploratory phase. We will review when that phase comes to an end and there is a move to production perhaps with some of these installations and look at it again.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to answer a bloody practical question there?
Yeah, from Derek, fantastic. So why not have your own refillable bottle? A couple aspects to that. It would be great if it could work. Obviously, I mean, craft beer is exploding around the world. Something I think that's actually a really positive thing because of the range of flavours and everything else it gives to consumers. And some of those craft beers, because they tend to have such a kind of local feel, do have setups where you can go to a shop and get beer direct from a keg, put it into your container, bring it home, use it again. It's growing quite a bit in the US with a container called a growler. It's quite interesting. But the challenge is how you do that at scale. And actually one of the big changes we've seen in beer, particularly in the developed world, the UK is actually quite a pronounced example, of course, is the change of consumption from in a sociable setting called a pub to drinking at home in front of Sky football. For example. And so, there's quite a big change in terms of increasing packs because of that. And actually, a keg, of course, is even more sustainable than a returnable glass bottle because it's an even more kind of efficient equation. So I think we're doing some things we could do a lot more to encourage the on-trade to grow again. And I think probably the solution will be a mix of kind of local packs like the kind of example you give, linked to craft beer perhaps, a rebuild of the on-trade in markets where it's got a bit weaker, and then seeking to protect returnables in quite creative ways. On the less consumption of alcohol, good question. I guess 3 points to that. The first is that in many parts of the world, the consumption of illicit alcohol outstrips formal alcohol quite significantly. So in Africa, it's estimated the economic value of the informal, untaxed, unregulated alcohol market is 3 times the size of the formal market. So there's a huge opportunity for us to grow as a business by attracting people away from those illicit alcohols, still using, creating local jobs through local sourcing and things, and actually improve the consumption there. Second, when you look at patterns of consumption of alcohol around the world, it's actually quite interesting. So you often have occasions where people drink too much at one sitting, but actually then don't drink much in between to the next weekend. And so there are quite significant opportunities to reduce the intensity of alcohol consumption on occasions, increase the frequency of it, and still stay well within, for example, government guidelines or whatever other local guidelines on alcohol consumption. And the third is the value piece, and that's probably the biggest important thing for the beer industry, is that we've done ourselves a massive disservice by all of our advertising over the last 30 years being aimed in a kind of blokey, jokey way at men between 18 and 35. And actually, there's a huge opportunity for us to compete with other beverages, wine, spirits, through being a bit more appealing and a bit less sexist and a bit more interesting. And so that's one of the things we'll be doing.
We'll have another 3 questions, I think, to... yes, at the back over there. And then over here.
Naomi Smith, I'm a PhD student at the University of Reading. I've got another question for Miranda about the fracking stuff. So we saw that great sort of schematic with all the associated risks, and it was determined these were sort of manageable risks. And I was wondering how it's determined if a risk is manageable, and whether the sort of the benefit of extracting the natural resource comes into setting this threshold as to whether it's manageable or not. Because it seems like if it was a perhaps slightly lower payoff, perhaps it wouldn't be as an acceptable risk.
And who was it? Yes, it was there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Roberts I'm a senior member of the LGA and also a CAMERA member. I'm just following up that other question. Is the basic brewing processes of SABMiller and AB now dinosaurial? And basically, should you not be getting back, as Marston's have done, to more regional brewers, local beer, local waters, local production, and local employment, which is why, as a brewer, you're losing out to the craft breweries.
Thank you. And there was a third one at the front here.
Thanks. David Norse, UCL. Another question for Andy, but of a different nature. It's about political and policy uncertainty in your partnership countries. Right? You used to have, you may still have, right, an incredibly efficient, low-energy brewery in South Sudan. Right? What happened when things went pear-shaped, and how do you handle that in your planning?
Thank you. Miranda.
Yes, on the question of benefits, we have to be a pragmatic regulator, and I think as a government body we wouldn't last very long or be any use, or indeed give people in the government the feeling that the taxpayers' money that came our way if we took too absolutist a view about our task. So we have to balance a lot of competing interests in such a way as to provide a sustainable answer for society at large. And that means balancing the interests of the desire to exploit a natural resource with the impact on the environment and the impact on people and the impact on other natural resources. So it is a balancing act, of course. I hope that answers your question. If anybody wants to talk to me more about this, I will be here until lunchtime and available in the breaks.
Thank you. Andy.
Okay, let me start with Southern Sudan. So you're right. I mean, we put about $50 million into an investment in Southern Sudan 4 years ago. We're the only local manufacturer there of beer and soft drinks and water. And in fact, because of all the kit we put in to ensure we had the right quality of supply, we also supply the UN compound and quite a few other international agencies around with water. And beer later on in the evening. But so one of our skills as a business is, because we've grown from emerging markets, originally from South Africa, but with some very talented people coming into our management stream from across Latin America in particular. I think we are better positioned in terms of managing on the ground those difficult engagements. So in most of our markets, you'd find a mixed management team of expats and locals. And expats often, say, in South Africa from Peru, or in Tanzania from El Salvador or something, quite mixed up in terms of the sources. What we had to do when the violence broke out was pull out the expats, but the local team stayed and are still running the operation at a lower level. But we believe it's important to be there and to, as long as the situation is safe for those employees, to continue to operate, because it's one of the few kind of local employers there and generates products that people want. The camera colleague. So I think there is quite a difference between ABI and us. ABI is the biggest brewer in the world. We're number 2. We're somewhat competitive, which is because our chief brewer, who's a lady called Catherine Smart, who was a professor brewing at Nottingham University, would chew your ear off for an hour about the quality difference between our beers around the world and ABI, and the standards that we keep to that they don't. But she'd also talk about the fact that our business is actually a local model. Perhaps not ultra-local in terms of regional, but we pretty much do brew always for local consumption. And that's partly because obviously the economics of brewing are that it's quite expensive to transport a beverage more than a few hundred miles at most. But it's also because our brand proposition is about these 200 local power brands around the world, which are about the identity they grew up with in those markets. And so brewing them locally is quite important. And so they are typically brewed within a relatively short area. But you're right that regional brands and craft are kind of exploding the discussion around what localness means, and I think that's quite a healthy and positive thing. And we're also involved in different pioneering craft efforts as well.
Well, thanks very much. I think given the time, we'd probably better move on to the coffee break. And please, could you be back here by 2:45? And so thank you again to all our speakers, and have some refreshments. No beer available, I'm afraid.
Well, good.